record. Okay, I think we are recording again, so I apologize to you. Those of you in the lecture hall for the interruption, I apologize to our online students. The software just crashed and I had to reboot all of that. Okay, let's reboot here. back to our text. So, Shankara here, speaking with his enlightened ahankara, says, I have no prana, therefore I can't do anything. He says, I have no buddhi, therefore I can't have knowledge or ignorance. So, vidya vidyetataha nastaha. Therefore, for me, there is neither, if there's no buddhi, by extension, there's neither knowledge nor ignorance. Since the buddhi is the locus of both knowledge and ignorance, no buddhi means no knowledge and no ignorance. All of this is true. Shankara finally switches from the negative to the positive. So far, everything he has been saying has been negation. I have no mind, I have no buddhi, I have no eyes, ears, no power of sight, hearing, etc., etc. And he says that for me, I have no eyes. For me, who is that me that Shankara is constantly referring to? That me is the swarupa, true nature, atma, which he finally refers to in the last line here, mama, for me. What kind of me? Chit-matra jyotish. For me, who is jyoti, light, which is what kind of light? Not this kind of light. He says light, which is chin-matra. By the word chit plus matra becomes chin-matra. He says the light we're talking about is not a physical kind of light, not like the light of the sun, but light which is chin-matra, consciousness alone. And now in the next verse, in the next verse, Shankara is going to elaborate on the swarupa. Notice we've gone through 2 verses of negation. Now we've switched from negation to assertion. And the assertion begins with chin-matra jyotish. He says, I am the light of consciousness. And then he continues to explain in verse 3. Nitya muktasya shuddhasya, nitya muktasya shuddhasya, kutastasya chila. Kutastasya vichalinaha, kutastasya vichalitaha, amritasyaksharasyavam, amritasyaksharasyavam, asharirasya sarvada, asharirasya sarvada. So he's saying now, he says, I am the possessor of none of the things referred to in the prior verses. But who is that possessor? And I'm saying possessor because all of this is in a possessive case. So he says, for me. For me. What kind of me? Nitya muktasya. For me, the one who is eternally free. Shuddhasya, eternally pure. And these 2 words are pointing to Shankara's, some people have a phrase they keep using again and again and again. Like you speak to someone and they keep saying, you know. So it's like that actually, is a little different, but that's actually a verbal tic. It's a different kind of phenomenon. But Shankara has something different. He has an expression he just loves to use over and over again in his commentaries. And in commentaries, because it doesn't fit into a verse, so in his commentaries, he likes to use this expression, nitya, shuddha, buddha, mukta swabhava. In fact, let me put it on the board. It's worth seeing that. Where is the board? Board is not there. There's the board. Okay. And I'll just use Roman letters just to make it more quick here. So his expression, nitya shuddha. Oops. No, look at that. I'm going for Devanagari. Buddha mukta swabhava. He loves this expression. He uses it again and again. Swabhava, I used the word before, swarupa. Swabhava has the same meaning. One's true nature, essential nature, essence. So Shankara says that I am one whose swabhava is nitya shuddha, nitya buddha, and nitya mukta. So these three expressions, that word nitya very deliberately gets connected to each of those three words. So nitya shuddha. Here shuddha in the sense of utterly unaffected by ignorance. Atma was never affected by ignorance. Even now, even in a state of ignorance, if you say, Swamiji, I'm not enlightened, fine. Your consciousness, there's that expression again, your consciousness is utterly unaffected by that ignorance. That ignorance is present in your mind and it causes lots of suffering and confusion. Fortunately, your true nature is utterly unaffected by that ignorance. Your true nature is nitya shuddha, has never been affected by ignorance. Therefore, your true nature is nitya buddha, eternally enlightened. Before you were born, consciousness is enlightened. In what sense? The absence, to be unenlightened is to identify with your body, mind, and senses and suffer. So before your birth, obviously there's no identification with body, mind, and senses. After your birth, consciousness exists, but that consciousness itself doesn't say, I want to be identified with body, mind, and senses. Consciousness doesn't do anything. That identification is mental phenomena. All kinds of identification, which is a result of ignorance, all exists in the mind. None of it belongs to consciousness. Therefore, your true nature, consciousness, swabhava, is nitya shuddha, eternally unaffected by ignorance. Nitya buddha, therefore eternally enlightened. Therefore, nitya mukta, eternally free. Atma didn't get into a state of bondage. Atma is not released from a state of bondage. This is Shankara's favorite expression, and obviously he can't use this expression in these verses because it doesn't fit into the meter. So in commentaries, however, he uses this expression frequently. Okay. Coming back here. So that's the first line. Nitya, for me, nitya muktasya, for the one who is eternally free. Nitya shuddhasya, for the one who is eternally pure, unaffected by ignorance. Kutastasya, the one who is unchanging. It's a reference to an anvil. What's interesting about the anvil is made of steel. And what you're pounding on, of course, you've probably never done that, I've never done that, but what you're pounding on, this is interesting. The anvil is made of steel. What you're pounding on is also made of steel. right? That's made of steel. This is, and you're pounding. One thing changes and the other thing doesn't. The anvil doesn't change, but what you're pounding on changes. So this is a metaphor. Everything is steel. Everything is Brahman. But part doesn't change. No, I shouldn't say part. The anvil doesn't change. The manifestation of steel in the form of whatever you're pounding on, that changes. The anvil doesn't change. So kutastha, I am for me, the one who is unchanging like an anvil. For me, the one who is avichalinaha, the one who doesn't move, the one who doesn't change. Unchanging consciousness. Amritasya, the one who is undying because unborn. Those two words go together. That which is born dies. That which is unborn has no death. Aksharasya, the one who akshara is decay. Aksharasya, for the one who is undecaying, the one who doesn't wear out. I think most of us are getting to the age now where we recognize our bodies are starting to wear out. That's what happens. Just like anything you use every day eventually wears out. Every day you use your toothbrush. Eventually it wears out, right? So every day we use these bodies, eventually they wear out. Consciousness doesn't wear out. Consciousness is akshara. Evam, thus, that consciousness is asharirasya sarvada, and also for me, who is asharirasya, me who has no sharira, me who am bodiless. Do you see something different in that last line? All the first three lines and the last line of the prior verse were all assertions. Here we're back to negation. So, which shows how a skillful teacher of Vedanta will deftly switch between these two methodologies, a methodology of assertion and a methodology of negation. Next. Jagat sava pipasava, Jagat sava pipasava, shoka mohau jara mriti, shoka mohau jara mriti, na vidyante shariratvad, na vidyante shariratvad, vyomavad vyapino mama, vyomavad vyapino mama. Start in the third line. Ashariratvat. There's our negation again. Because of the absence of a physical body, because I have no body, because I am bodiless, therefore, na vidyante. Certain problems do not exist. Plenty of problems exist for these bodies, which are wearing out like your toothbrush. Good thing your body lasts longer than that toothbrush, but somewhat longer. Anyway, these bodies, which are wearing out, are subject to lots of problems. In fact, there's a common expression of 6 problems, which are described in the first 2 lines. These 6 problems, 6 shad, and these problems are oddly called urmi. Urmi means wave, and I'll explain that in just a moment. These 6 problems are called shad urmi, 6 waves, and I'll explain why they're called waves. What are those 6 problems? Jagatsa, desire to eat, hunger. Pipasa, desire to drink. Thirst, hunger and thirst. Shoka, sorrow. Moha, delusion. Jara, old age. And mriti, death. So here we have the 6: hunger, thirst, sorrow, delusion, old age, and death. Shad urmi, these same 6 are taken again and again. Of course, if we only had these 6, maybe it wouldn't be so bad. We have many more than these 6. But these 6 are held as examples of the kinds of problems we have when we have a physical body. Now, notice if you don't have a physical body, you've got no hunger, no thirst. If you don't have a physical body that hosts the mind, you don't have sorrow, you don't have delusion. And if you don't have a physical body, if you are just consciousness, chin matra, then you have no jara, no aging, no decay, and no mriti, no death. All of these become problematic when you identify with your body. You can have a body without identifying with it, right? And this is Vedanta. You have a body, and an unenlightened person being identified with the body takes the problems of the body as very real, very threatening. They affect me. An enlightened person has the same physical problems as anyone else, but the enlightened person is not identified with the physical body. So the enlightened person knows that all of these problems belong to the body and they don't affect me in any way whatsoever. This is the healthy detachment from the physical body. Okay. We'll just finish up on the Shad Urmi. Why are they called 6 waves? And my guru liked to describe it in a very vivid way. You've heard the expression, these are 6 waves in the samsara sagara, the ocean of worldly existence. So a very common metaphor is if you're out in the middle of the ocean without a boat, being tossed about by these waves. And as my guru liked to describe it, every time a wave crashes down on you, you're then forced underneath the water and you can't breathe and you struggle to get back up to the top of the surface and you finally get to the top and it's wonderful. You get to breathe again. The air is warm and sweet. The sun is shining. The wind is blowing. The sky is blue. And then another wave crashes down on you. This is his description. Very nice. And notice that it describes a cycle of suffering and pleasure. Suffering and pleasure. That's what's meant by the waves. The waves come and go. Suffering comes and goes. Happiness comes and goes. These are the waves of life. And here they're called waves of suffering, these Shad Urmi, these 6 waves. But he says, Asharira twat, because I don't have a body, na vidyante. Why should I worry about these waves? I don't have a body. They don't affect me. Vyomavat vyapinaha mama. For me, the one who is unaffected by those waves, for me, the one who is vyapinaha, the one who is all-pervasive, vyomavat, like space. How do those waves affect water? They go. They keep going up and down. Nothing happens to water. Water is unchanging. What's so significant about that samsara sagara metaphor is, suppose, you can imagine on top of the ocean, it is so turbulent. Suppose you were to go down maybe 10 feet. No waves. Of course, the water is probably still moving a bit. Suppose you go down 100 feet. By the way, you have to be a skillful scuba diver. 100 feet is considered quite deep. But if you were to go down 100 feet, the water would be perfectly still. Perfectly still. All that tumult would be going on the surface. There could be a wild storm raging. I gave a nice example of a sunny, beautiful day, but suppose there's a wild storm. The wind is blowing and the waves are crashing, and it's just a really wild hurricane up there. Down 100 feet? Nothing. Perfect stillness. This is what Shankara is describing now. Consciousness is the equivalent of that water. Perfect stillness. Fact is, all that tumult continues on the surface. The surface is where the activity takes place. That surface represents your mind. And your mind is subject to all these waves, these 6 waves and much more. So all of that turbulence takes place at the surface where this is a metaphor, right? So where water meets air, we'll say where consciousness meets mind. It's a metaphor. Don't try to take it too seriously. Don't try. Consciousness meets mind. Is there a barrier? That's not. Don't get technical here. This is just a kind of a metaphor, where the ocean meets air is where the turbulence takes place. Where consciousness meets mind is where turbulence takes place. 100 feet down in the ocean, perfectly still. Down from the mind means, like in meditation, when you meditate, you go away from the mind, in a metaphoric speaking. You sink down. You may have had that feeling in meditation. I get that sometimes. You're just sinking down into silence. It's a wonderful feeling. Sinking down into silence, and it is just perfect peace. Okay. Let's see one more verse. Asparshas, asparshatvana me sprishtir, asparshatvana me sprishtir, na jihvatvarasagnyata, na jihvatvarasagnyata, nitya vijnana rupasya jnana jnanena me sada, jnana jnanena me sada. So here Shankara completes this negation. So these first opening 5 verses, not in type, but notice he switched back and forth between assertion and negation, and he's back here to complete with negation. He says, asparshatvat, because I have no organ of touch, na me sprishtihi, therefore I have no sensation. Can't say organ of touch is called skin, but you can't say I have no skin. That doesn't make any sense. Atma doesn't feel anything in the tactile sense. Consciousness has no tactile sense. Further, ajihvat, you have to break the words, na ajihvatvat, because I have no tongue, Na rasajñata. I don't have any taste. I can't discern different tastes, different flavors, because I have no tongue. So Atma has no capacity to sense anything in the world. It's going to be the next verse. We'll save that. Just to show you where this goes, with the next verse, which we won't see today, Shankara explains that process of sensation, which is surprisingly complex, even in modern neuroscience. The fact that we see and hear and taste and touch, every one of our senses are so fantastically complex in the way they work in the external organ, like your tongue and your skin, and the way your brain responds to that nervous stimulation. It's just amazingly complex. In Vedanta, not surprisingly, it's also fairly complex. And we'll see that described in the next class. Since it's complex, I won't describe it here, but that's where Shankara is going with this discussion. He's talking about our senses of taste, smell, and touch, etc. By the way, I don't need to remind you that your experience of the world is entirely dependent on your five senses, right? Sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. If you couldn't see, then just take this a little mental experiment. Suppose you were blind, suppose you were deaf, and suppose your body was numb, head to foot. What would that be like? Just take a moment. Blind, deaf, and numb. That sounds good. What would you experience? You get the point? Blind, deaf, and numb, the world goes away. Our experience of the world, as we've observed many times, is indirect by means of these five senses, and that's what Shankara will talk about in the next verse. So, just to establish the importance of understanding that none of these sense organs affect consciousness. Consciousness, your true nature is consciousness, utterly independent of the senses, which is why that consciousness is never affected by any worldly problems. Worldly problems come to you only through your senses. If you are independent of the senses, you are independent of those worldly problems. Let's finish this up. So Shankara says, I have no senses of taste, smell, touch, sight, and hearing. For me, who is nitya vijnana rupasya. Here vijnana means consciousness, chit. Nitya vijnana, eternal consciousness. One whose rupa, swarupa, same thing. For me, whose true nature is eternal, unchanging consciousness, none of that exists for me, including in the last line, na me, also for me, na jnana ajnana, as he said before. There's no knowledge or ignorance. And here I can bring in that point. I retracted the point when I was talking about vidya and avidya, but it applies here. And that is, the word jnana can mean knowledge as we generally understand it, knowledge of a particular thing. But the word jnana in Sanskrit can also mean any mental event. Vritti. In fact, we call it vrittignana. So knowledge here means any mental activity. So when he says jnana and ajnana, here jnana means mental activities. Those mental activities and ajnana, ignorance, none of that affects me. So this is a good place to stop. So we've seen in detail how all of these problems are associated with the body, mind, and especially with the senses. And when we meet next time, we'll see uh, how that identification takes place, how ignorance causes identification and identification causes suffering. We'll see that in next week's class. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinah Sarve Santu Niramayaha Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschid Dukkha Bhag Bhavet Asato Ma Satgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritangamaya Om Shanti 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 Om Tat Sat.